The gunshot that killed Kane O'Malley's father on a dusty street in Abilene, Texas, when Kane was 19 years old, froze something deep inside his chest that never quite thawed. Not through the 10 years that followed. Not through the endless miles of cattle drives and lonely nights under stars that offered no comfort. Not through the whiskey or the violence or the hollow victories that marked his path westward across the unforgiving landscape of 1879 America. Kane rode into Winnemucca, Nevada on a September afternoon when the desert heat shimmered off the hard-packed earth like broken promises. The town sat small and weathered against the vast emptiness, a collection of false-fronted buildings and desperate hopes strung along a single main street. He had come because the telegram in his pocket offered work managing a struggling ranch outside town, and Kane needed distance more than he needed money. Distance from memories, from people, from anything that might crack the ice he had built around himself, one deliberate layer at a time. The saloon smelled of sawdust and stale beer. Kane ordered whiskey and took it to a corner table, his back to the wall, his gray eyes scanning the room with the automatic wariness of a man who trusted nothing and no one. The bartender kept his distance. The other patrons gave him space. Kane had perfected the art of silence, the particular stillness that warned people away more effectively than words ever could. He was halfway through his second drink when she walked in, and the entire room seemed to shift. She wore a simple calico dress the color of sage, her dark auburn hair pinned up in a way that revealed the elegant line of her neck, and she moved with purpose through the doorway like she belonged anywhere she chose to be. Kane watched her over the rim of his glass, noting the way conversations faltered, the way men straightened and women whispered. She walked directly to the bar, spoke quietly to the bartender, then turned and surveyed the room with eyes the color of summer grass meeting autumn earth, somewhere between green and gold. Those eyes landed on Kane and held. He should have looked away. That was his habit, his defense, the wall he had built brick by brick. But something in her gaze challenged him, assessed him, saw through him in a way that made his jaw tighten. She walked toward his table and he tensed, every muscle preparing for whatever confrontation this would become. "You're Kane O'Malley," she said, not a question. Her voice carried the faint dust of exhaustion, but underneath it ran pure steel. "I'm Rose Sinclair. My father owns the Broken Spur Ranch. He sent that telegram." Kane set down his glass with deliberate care. "Your father." "He's dying," Rose said, and there was no plea for sympathy in the words, just flat statement. "Consumption. He has maybe 3 months, the doctor says, maybe less. He needs someone who can run the ranch, someone who knows cattle and horses and can handle the work." The telegram said nothing about dying. "Would you have come if it had?" Rose pulled out the chair across from him without invitation and sat. Up close, Kane could see the shadows under her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the fierce determination that held her upright when she clearly wanted to collapse. "I need help, Mr. O'Malley. The ranch is all we have, and the hands we've got left are good men, but they need direction. They need someone who knows what he's doing. Your reputation says you're that man." "My reputation," Kane said, his voice flat as winter ground, "should tell you I'm not the helping kind. Your reputation says you're the best horseman between here and California, that you can break a wild Mustang without breaking its spirit, that you drove cattle from Texas to Montana without losing a single head, and that you keep your word once you give it." Rose leaned forward, her hands flat on the scarred table between them. "I don't care if you're friendly, Mr. O'Malley. I care if you're good at what you do. My father is dying, and this ranch is his legacy, and I will not watch it die with him." The passion in her voice cracked something in Kane's carefully maintained armor, just the smallest fissure. barely noticeable. He pushed his glass aside and studied her, this woman who marched into saloons and demanded help from strangers, who stared at him without flinching, who carried her grief like a weapon instead of a wound. "Wages?" he asked. "40 a month plus room and board. 50 and I'm in charge." "Completely. No interference." Rose's eyes narrowed. 45 and you consult with me on major decisions. It's still my ranch, Mr. O'Malley." Despite himself, despite the ice and the walls and the decade of deliberate isolation, Kane felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Not quite a smile, but close enough to startle him. "Deal." They shook hands across the table, her grip firm and dry, and Kane told himself this was just another job, another temporary stop on his endless journey away from connection and toward nothing in particular. He told himself he wouldn't get attached to the dying man, or the struggling ranch, or the woman with fire in her eyes and exhaustion in her bones. He had become very good at lying to himself over the years. The Broken Spur Ranch sat in a valley between rust-colored hills, 1,500 acres of hard Nevada ground that grudgingly supported cattle and horses. The house was adobe and timber, weathered but solid, surrounded by outbuildings in various states of repair. Rose drove the wagon from town with Kane riding his black gelding alongside, and she pointed out landmarks and boundaries with brisk efficiency. Her voice never wavering even when she spoke about water rights they were losing or fences that needed mending or the neighbor who kept making offers to buy them out at prices that insulted her intelligence. James Sinclair sat on the porch in a rocking chair, wrapped in blankets despite the lingering afternoon heat. He had the wasted look of a man being eaten from the inside, but his eyes were sharp and clear when they fixed on Kane. "You don't look like much," James said by way of greeting. "Neither does your ranch," Kane replied, swinging down from his saddle. James barked a laugh that turned into a cough. Rose moved to her father's side instantly, producing a handkerchief, supporting his shoulders until the fit passed. When James straightened, there was blood on the cloth but satisfaction on his face. "I like him," James told his daughter. "He doesn't pretend." "Pretending won't save the ranch," Kane said. "What do you need done first?" They talked until sunset painted the desert in shades of copper and gold, James laying out the problems with the matter-of-fact tone of a general describing a losing battle. The spring in the north pasture was running low. The winter hay stores were inadequate. They had 3 pregnant mares that needed careful watching. The cattle were scattered across the range and needed gathering before the weather turned. The list went on, each item another weight added to the already crushing load. Kane listened without interrupting, his face expressionless, his mind cataloging and prioritizing with the mechanical efficiency he had developed over years of solving other people's problems while ignoring his own. When James finished, Kane nodded once. "I'll need to see the books," he said. "And talk to your hands. I'll have a plan by tomorrow evening." Rose showed him to the bunkhouse, a long, low building where 4 weather-beaten men looked up from their card game with obvious curiosity. She introduced them quickly. Tom Garrett, grizzled and bow-legged, who had worked the Broken Spur for 20 years. His son Michael, barely 21, eager and untested. Diego Ruiz, quiet and competent, whose family had ranched this land long before white settlers arrived. And Pete Morrison, a former cavalry scout with a limp and haunted eyes that Kane recognized immediately. "This is Kane O'Malley," Rose announced. "He's taking over as foreman, effective now. You answer to him." She left without waiting for response, her spine straight and proud even as exhaustion dragged at her steps. Kane watched her go, then turned back to face 4 sets of evaluating eyes. "I'm not here to make friends," Kane said into the silence. "I'm here to work. You do your jobs, we'll get along fine. You slack off or cause trouble, you're done. Questions? Tom Garrett spat tobacco juice into a tin can. Can you back up that mouth of yours? Try me and find out, Kane said without heat. But it'll cost you time we don't have to waste. Tom studied him for a long moment, then grunted. Fair enough. You want to start tonight or wait for morning, 4 o'clock. We're riding the North Range, checking that spring and seeing what cattle we find. Kane moved toward the empty bunk at the far end of the room. Get some sleep. You'll need it. He lay awake long after the others started snoring, staring at the rough timber ceiling and wondering what he was doing here. Why he had agreed to this doomed project. Why Rose Sinclair's determination had gotten under his skin when he had spent years perfecting his immunity to other people's troubles. Outside, the desert night sang its ancient song of coyotes and wind, and Kane felt the familiar loneliness settle over him like a second skin, comfortable and suffocating in equal measure. The work started before dawn and didn't stop until dark, day after day, the rhythm of it almost meditative in its intensity. Kane drove the men hard but drove himself harder, always first up and last to bed, always pushing further than anyone else. He found problems everywhere he looked. Rotting fence posts, equipment held together with hope and baling wire, animals that needed veterinary care they couldn't afford, systems that barely functioned. But he also found solutions. He negotiated with the neighboring ranchers for shared water access during the drought. He organized the men into efficient teams, playing to their strengths. He spent hours gentling the pregnant mares, his touch patient and sure, earning their trust through consistency rather than force. He repaired what could be repaired and rebuilt what couldn't, his hands blistered and bleeding by the end of each day, but his face remaining impassive, revealing nothing. Rose was everywhere, refusing to be sidelined despite her father's condition. She worked alongside the men, mending fences and mucking stables, cooking meals and keeping books, moving through exhaustion into some realm beyond where only will sustained her. Kane watched her from the corner of his eye, irritated by her refusal to rest, grudgingly impressed by her resilience. They argued constantly. She questioned his decisions about selling some of the older cattle. He challenged her bookkeeping methods. She disagreed with his plan to break and sell young horses to raise cash. He criticized her tendency to coddle the hands. Their debates happened over dinner in the ranch house kitchen, with James listening from his chair by the fire, occasionally interjecting but mostly just watching with something that might have been amusement. You're too focused on short-term gains, Rose said one evening, slamming her ledger closed. Those horses are part of our breeding program. Your breeding program doesn't matter if you lose the ranch to debt before those foals mature, Kane shot back. We need money now, not 2 years from now. So we should just sacrifice the future for the present. There won't be a future if we don't survive the present. You think I don't know that? Rose's voice cracked, just slightly, just enough to reveal the fear beneath the anger. You think I haven't been watching my father die while trying to hold this place together with nothing but stubbornness and prayer? Don't lecture me about hard choices, Mr. O'Malley. I've been making them since before you rode into town. The kitchen fell silent except for the snap and pop of the fire. Kane's jaw worked as he fought down words he couldn't afford to say, feelings he couldn't afford to have. James coughed, the wet, rattling sound that had become the soundtrack of the house, and Rose immediately moved to his side. Kane left without another word, walking out into the cold November night, breathing hard like he'd been running. His hands were shaking, and he shoved them into his pockets, staring up at the brilliant scatter of stars and willing himself back into the familiar numbness, the safe ice. but the fissure in his armor had widened, and Rose Sinclair's pain had slipped through the gap and lodged somewhere in his chest where he couldn't dig it out. He stood there until the shaking stopped, until he had rebuilt his walls, until he could face going back inside to the bunkhouse, and pretending he felt nothing at all. James Sinclair died on a gray December morning when frost covered the desert and made everything look clean and new. He went peacefully, Rose holding one hand and Kane the other, though Kane wasn't entirely sure how he had ended up there, standing vigil with this family that wasn't his own. James's last words were to Rose, "You're stronger than you know. Don't forget that." Then he looked at Kane and said, "Take care of her." And before Kane could protest or refuse or explain that he didn't take care of anyone, James was gone, his last breath sighing out like wind through canyon walls. Rose didn't cry. She closed her father's eyes gently, arranged his hands across his chest, and then walked outside into the cold morning. Kane found her an hour later in the stable, viciously mucking out stalls with an energy that bordered on violence. "You should rest," he said from the doorway. "I should work." The pitchfork slammed into the straw. "Work doesn't care if I'm grieving, the horses don't care, the cattle don't care, the bank certainly doesn't care. The hands can handle it for one day. And what am I supposed to do instead? Sit in that house where everything reminds me that he's gone. Thank you, but I'll pass." Another vicious stab with the pitchfork. Kane should have left. That was what the old Kane would have done, the Kane who had perfected the art of emotional distance. But something had changed in the months at the Broken Spur. Something had shifted in those late-night arguments and early morning rides and shared meals. Something had cracked in the ice around his heart. He walked into the stable, took the pitchfork from Rose's hands despite her protest, and set it aside. Then he did something he hadn't done in 10 years. He reached out deliberately to comfort another human being. He put his arms around Rose Sinclair and held her while she finally broke. She sobbed against his chest, her whole body shaking, and Kane stood solid as stone and let her grief wash over both of them. His hands moved awkwardly at first, one on her back and one in her hair, but then some instinct he thought he had killed long ago took over, and he held her the way she needed to be held. Firmly enough that she knew he wouldn't let go, but gently enough that she could break free if she wanted. She didn't want to. She clung to him and cried until she had no tears left, until exhaustion made her sway on her feet. Only then did Kane loosen his grip enough to look down at her swollen eyes and red nose and devastated expression. "Come on," he said quietly. "I'm taking you to the house." "I don't need to be taken care of," Rose protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "I know you don't need it. I'm doing it anyway." Kane kept one arm around her shoulders and guided her across the yard. Inside the house, he steered her to her father's chair by the fire, wrapped her in blankets, and set about making coffee with the grim determination of a man on a mission. Rose watched him through her exhaustion, and when he handed her the steaming cup, she said, "Thank you." Kane nodded and turned to go, but her voice stopped him. "Stay, please. I don't want to be alone." He should have refused. Staying was dangerous. Staying meant caring, and caring meant pain, and pain was what he had spent 10 years running from. But he looked at Rose's face, at the raw vulnerability she was showing him, and found he couldn't form the word no, so he stayed. He sat in the other chair and they watched the fire together in silence, drinking coffee and sharing grief, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. It terrified Kane down to his bones. The funeral happened 3 days later, a simple graveside service attended by half the county. James Sinclair had been respected if not wealthy, and people came to pay their respects and offer condolences that Rose accepted with quiet grace. Kane stood slightly apart from the crowd, his hat in his hands, his face expressionless. But when Rose swayed on her feet during the final prayer, his hand was there instantly to steady her elbow. And afterward, when the neighbors brought food and filled the house with well-meaning chaos, he stayed close, a silent presence that asked nothing and offered everything. People noticed. Kane saw the speculative looks, heard the whispered conversations that cut off when he approached. The widow Thompson asked Rose pointed questions about her plans now that James was gone. The banker, a slick man named Harrison, mentioned that the offer to buy the ranch still stood, probably for the best now that she was alone. Kane watched Rose's spine stiffen, watched her smile turn sharp and dangerous. "I'm not alone," Rose said clearly. "I have an excellent foreman and a good crew and my father's legacy to honor. The ranch is not for sale, Mr. Harrison. It won't ever be for sale." Harrison's eyes slid to Kane, calculating and cold. "Foremen come and go, Miss Sinclair. You need more than hired help to run a spread this size." "Good thing I've got more than that, then." Rose's voice could have cut glass. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have guests to attend to." She walked away, head high, and Kane felt something unfamiliar bloom in his chest, something that might have been pride or might have been something more dangerous. He met Harrison's gaze steadily until the banker looked away, and that felt like victory, small but significant. The crowd eventually dispersed as the sun sank toward the horizon. Kane helped Rose clean up, moving through the house collecting plates and glasses in companionable silence. When the last dish was washed and put away, Rose leaned against the kitchen counter and looked at him directly. "Are you planning to stay?" she asked. "Or was this just until my father died?" "I said I'd help with the ranch," Kane replied carefully. "That's not an answer." "What do you want me to say? The truth?" Rose crossed her arms. "I need to know if you're committed to this or if I should start looking for a replacement. I can't afford to lose time if you're going to leave." Kane stared at her, at the challenge in her eyes, at the barely concealed hope beneath her tough exterior. He thought about leaving, about saddling his horse and riding out into the gathering dark, about returning to the safe loneliness of the trail. The idea held all the appeal of broken glass. "I'll stay," he said, and felt the words settle into his bones like truth. "Through spring at least. Get you through calving season and the horse sales." It wasn't a promise of forever, but it was more than he had given anyone in a decade. Rose nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Through spring," she agreed. "We'll see where we are then." Winter settled over the desert like a cold blanket, bringing freezing nights and thin frost that melted by noon. The work continued with relentless intensity as they prepared for calving season. Kane pushed everyone hard, but especially himself, often working until his hands cramped and his vision blurred. It was easier than thinking, easier than feeling, easier than acknowledging the way his awareness of Rose had become a constant hum in the back of his mind. He noticed everything about her now, against his will and his better judgment. The way she tucked loose strands of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. The small sound of satisfaction she made when she successfully balanced the books. The grace with which she moved even when exhausted. The laugh she tried to hide when Diego told bad jokes. The fierce protectiveness she showed toward the animals and the men under her care. The vulnerability she revealed only in unguarded moments, usually late at night when she thought no one was watching. Kane watched. He couldn't seem to stop himself. And the more he watched, the more the ice around his heart continued its slow, inevitable thaw. They fell into patterns together without consciously deciding to. Morning started with coffee in the kitchen before dawn, sitting across from each other in comfortable silence. Evenings ended with going over the day's work and planning tomorrow's, sometimes arguing but more often finding unexpected agreement. Meals became shared events, Rose cooking while Kane cleaned, their movements synchronized like dancers who knew each other's steps. The hands noticed. Tom made knowing comments that Kane ignored. Diego smiled more than usual. Pete watched with his careful scout's eyes and said nothing, which somehow felt more significant than words. Michael, young and romantic, asked Kane directly one evening if he was courting Miss Sinclair. "No," Kane said flatly. "Why not? She's pretty and smart and owns a ranch." "Because I'm not the courting type." "Maybe you should be," Michael said with the confidence of youth. "She looks at you different than other men." Kane's hand stilled on the bridle he was mending. "Different how? Like she sees you. Really sees you, not just the cold face you show everyone." Michael shrugged. "My ma used to say that's how you know someone's special, when they see past your defenses to who you really are." "Your ma sounds like a romantic." "My ma was married 40 years to my pa and they loved each other until the day she died." Michael met Kane's eyes directly. "Don't think that makes her wrong." Kane returned to his mending and didn't answer, but the words lodged in his mind and wouldn't leave. That night, unable to sleep, he walked out to check on the pregnant mares and found Rose already there, sitting on a hay bale and watching the horses with distant eyes. "Couldn't sleep?" Kane asked quietly. Rose startled, then relaxed when she saw it was him. "Too much thinking, not enough tired." Dangerous combination. Kane leaned against the stall door, maintaining careful distance. "I keep wondering if I'm making the right choices," Rose admitted. "My father knew what he was doing. I'm just guessing half the time and hoping I don't destroy everything he built." "You're doing fine." "Am I?" She looked at him, really looked at him the way Michael had described. "Or are you just keeping us afloat through sheer competence while I pretend to be in charge? It's your ranch, Rose. I just work here. You do more than that and you know it." She stood, brushing hay from her skirt. "You saved us, Kane. The Broken Spur would have failed without you. I would have failed without you." "No, you wouldn't have," Kane said and meant it. "You're stronger than you think you are. Your father was right about that." They stood in the warm darkness of the stable, the horses breathing softly around them, and something shifted in the space between them. Rose took a step closer and Kane's heart, the heart he had thought frozen beyond recovery, beat faster. "Who were you before?" Rose asked softly. "Before the cold cowboy who keeps everyone at arm's length. Someone I don't want to remember." "Why not?" Kane looked away, jaw tight. "Because remembering hurts. So you just decided to stop feeling anything, to wall yourself off from the entire world." Rose's voice held no judgment, only genuine curiosity. It was easier than the alternative, which was caring about people who leave. The words came out harsh, edged with old pain. "My mother died when I was 12. My father got shot when I was 19. Died in my arms in the street because he stepped in to stop a fight that wasn't his business. Every person I ever let close either left or got taken, so I stopped letting people close." "That sounds lonely," Rose said quietly. "Lonely is safe." "Is it?" She took another step closer. "Because from where I'm standing, lonely looks like its own kind of death. Slower than a bullet, but just as final." Kane wanted to argue, to push her away, to rebuild his walls and restore his safe isolation. But he was so tired of the cold, so exhausted by the loneliness he had worn like armor for 10 years. And Rose was close enough now that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used, close enough that it would take almost nothing to reach out and touch her. "You scare me," he admitted. The words dragged from somewhere deep and hidden. "Why?" "Because you make me want things I gave up on." "Like what?" "Like this." Kane reached out with a hand that trembled slightly and touched her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her soft skin. Like connection, like mattering to someone. Like maybe not being alone for the rest of my life. Rose's breath caught. She lifted her own hand and placed it over his, holding it against her cheek. You already matter to me, Kane. You've mattered for a while now. I'm not good at this. I'm not good at being what someone needs. I don't need you to be anything except honest. Rose turned her face slightly, pressing a kiss to his palm. I'm not asking for promises or forever. I'm just asking you to stop hiding, to let me in the way I've let you in. Kane studied her face, searching for uncertainty or doubt, but finding only steady determination mixed with hope. He thought about Michael's words, about seeing and being seen. He thought about his father dying in his arms, but also about his father's life, about the love he had shared with Kane's mother, about the risks he had taken, and the connections he had valued even knowing they could be lost. Being afraid to live was just another kind of death. Rose had been right about that. I don't know how to do this, Kane said roughly. Neither do I, Rose admitted. We'll figure it out together. He kissed her then, finally giving in to the wanting that had been building for months, and it felt like stepping off a cliff into open air, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Rose made a small sound against his mouth and wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, and Kane let himself fall, let the walls crumble, let the ice finally, completely shatter. They broke apart eventually, both breathing hard, foreheads resting together. Kane kept his arms around Rose like she might disappear if he let go, and she seemed content to stay exactly where she was. This is going to complicate things, Kane said. Probably, Rose agreed. Is that a problem? Not for me. But people will talk. The widow Thompson already has opinions. Rose laughed, the sound bright and genuine. The widow Thompson has opinions about everything. Let her talk. Your neighbors might not like their eligible neighbor taken off the market by a drifter. Good thing I don't care what they like. Rose pulled back enough to look at him seriously. Are you a drifter, Kane, or are you someone who could stay? It was the question that mattered, the one that would determine everything else. Kane thought about leaving, about riding away from the Broken Spur and Rose and the terrifying vulnerability of caring. Then he thought about staying, about building something instead of running, about letting himself be seen and known and loved. I'm someone who could stay, he said, and felt the truth of it settle into his bones. If you'll have me. I'll have you, Rose said simply, and kissed him again to seal the promise. News spread through the small community with the speed of wildfire. By the time Kane and Rose appeared together at the general store in Winnemucca, a week later, walking side by side with a new ease between them, the speculation had reached fever pitch. The widow Thompson sniffed disapprovingly. Harrison the banker looked calculating and vaguely annoyed. But most people smiled, nodded approval, offered quiet congratulations. Tom slapped Kane on the back so hard he nearly stumbled. About damn time, the old cowboy said with satisfaction. Been wondering when you'd pull your head out and see what was right in front of you. Was I that obvious? Kane asked, slightly mortified. Son, you've been watching that girl like she hung the moon since about October. Only person who didn't know how you felt was you. Tom grinned. And maybe her, though women usually figure these things out faster than we do. Diego and Pete offered quieter congratulations, but with genuine warmth. Michael looked smug, like he had personally arranged the entire romance. The Hands threw an impromptu celebration that night, breaking out a bottle of whiskey someone had been saving and toasting the happy couple, until Rose laughingly declared they all had work in the morning and needed to sleep. Kane walked her back to the main house, their hands linked, her head resting against his shoulder. The night was cold and clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. At the porch steps, Rose turned to face him. "You could come inside," she offered softly. "Your reputation," Kane protested, though his body very much wanted to accept, "is already the subject of intense speculation, according to the widow Thompson." Rose smiled. "But I wasn't suggesting anything improper. Just that it seems silly for you to sleep in the bunkhouse when there's a perfectly good couch by the fire." "Just the couch, for now." She kissed him, sweet and lingering. "I may be bold, Kane O'Malley, but I'm not that bold, not yet." "Yet?" he asked, warmth spreading through his chest. "Yet," she confirmed. "We have time. For the first time in months, I feel like we actually have time." They did have time, and they used it well. Through the rest of that winter, and into the early spring of 1880, Kane and Rose built something real and solid, as carefully constructed as the new barn they raised to replace the collapsing old one. They learned each other slowly, trading stories and secrets, revealing the people they had been before grief and loneliness had carved them into new shapes. Rose told him about growing up on the ranch, about her mother who died when she was 15, about the loneliness of being the only child of a widower in a landscape that stretched empty in all directions. She talked about her dreams for the Broken Spur, her plans for breeding programs and water conservation, her hope to make something that would last beyond her own lifetime. Kane, haltingly at first but with increasing ease, talked about his childhood in Texas, about his father's warmth and his mother's laugh, about the terrible day in Abilene that changed everything. He described the decade of drifting that followed, the deliberate isolation, the slow freezing of his heart. He admitted his fear that he had waited too long, damaged himself too thoroughly, that he might not know how to love properly anymore. "You're doing fine," Rose assured him, curled against his side on the couch where he now spent most nights, propriety be damned. "Love isn't something you forget. It's not a skill that atrophies. How can you be sure? Because I feel it from you." She placed her hand over his heart. "In the way you gentle the horses. In the way you teach Michael without making him feel stupid. In the way you sit with Tom and let him tell the same stories over and over. In the way you look at me like I'm precious. You haven't forgotten how to love, Kane. You just forgot that you were allowed to." He kissed her hair and held her closer, marveling at how natural it felt, how right, how completely she had knocked down walls he had thought were permanent structures. The cold cowboy who rode into Winnemucca had melted away, and in his place was someone Kane barely recognized but was learning to accept. A man capable of connection, of vulnerability, of hope. Spring brought calving season and long, exhausting days of helping cows deliver, watching for complications, warming chilled newborns by the fire. Kane worked with tireless focus, but now he smiled occasionally, joked with the hands, accepted help when he needed it instead of driving himself to collapse. Rose watched the transformation with quiet joy, and when he caught her looking, he didn't turn away. They saved all but 2 of the calves, a success rate that had Rose nearly dancing with relief. The finances remained tight but manageable, especially after Kane's carefully selected young horses sold for good prices at the spring auction. The water situation improved when Diego discovered a new spring on the eastern boundary. Slowly, incrementally, the Broken Spur stabilized and began to thrive. On an April evening when the desert was turning green with unexpected rain, Kane found Rose in her father's chair, staring at the fire with distant eyes. He sat beside her and took her hand, waiting until she was ready to speak. "He would have liked seeing this," Rose said quietly. "The ranch doing well, us together, all of it." "I think he knew," Kane offered, At the end, he asked me to take care of you. He did. Right before he died. I didn't know how to tell him that you don't need taking care of." Kane smiled slightly. "But I'm starting to understand that taking care of someone isn't the same as thinking they're helpless. It just means being there, supporting them, standing beside them instead of in front of them." Rose turned to look at him fully, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I love you, Kane O'Malley. I should have said it before, but I'm saying it now. I love you." The words landed in Kane's chest like a benediction, like forgiveness, like coming home after years of wandering. He had thought he would never hear those words again, had convinced himself he didn't need them, had built his entire adult life around not needing them. But hearing them from Rose, seeing the truth of them in her face, he realized how desperately he had been craving exactly this. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I didn't think I could anymore, didn't think I remembered how, but you made me remember, you made me feel again." "So stay," Rose said simply. "Not just through spring, not just for the ranch. Stay because you want to be here, because you choose this life, because you choose me." "I already chose you," Kane said. "Probably the day you walked into that saloon and demanded I help you. I just didn't know it yet. Is that a yes?" "That's a yes." He pulled her into his lap, holding her close. "I'm staying, Rose, for good, forever, however long you'll have me." "Forever sounds about right," Rose said, and kissed him with all the passion and promise that word contained. They married in May, a simple ceremony in the parlor of the main house, with the ranch hands serving as witnesses and the circuit preacher officiating. Rose wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit, and Kane wore his best clothes, his hair slicked back, his hands shaking slightly as he slid the simple gold band onto her finger. The vows were traditional, but when Kane said, "I do," he meant it with every fiber of his being, a commitment more absolute than anything he had ever promised before. The celebration lasted late into the night, with music and dancing and enough food to feed twice their number. Kane, who had not danced in 10 years, let Rose teach him again, stumbling through reels and waltzes with more enthusiasm than grace. She laughed at his mistakes and praised his improvements, and he thought he had never been happier, had never imagined he could be this happy again. Later, alone finally in the bedroom that had been Rose's and was now theirs, they came together with tenderness and passion, learning each other in this new way, building another layer of intimacy onto the foundation they had already constructed. Afterward, Rose lay with her head on Kane's chest, listening to his heartbeat, and he stroked her hair and stared at the ceiling and marveled at the sheer impossible miracle of his life. "No regrets?" Rose asked quietly. "About what? Giving up the drifting? The freedom? The ability to just ride away whenever things get hard?" Kane considered the question seriously, because she deserved serious answers. "I won't lie and say it's not sometimes terrifying to care this much, to have something I could lose. But no, I don't regret it. This is better. You're better than any freedom I had before." "Good answer," Rose murmured, already half asleep. Kane held her and watched the moonlight through the window and felt, for the first time in 10 years, complete peace. The years that followed were not without challenges. Droughts came and went, testing their water management and forcing difficult decisions about herd sizes. Harsh winters killed animals and damaged buildings. Rose miscarried their first child 6 months into the pregnancy, and Kane held her through the grief, offering the comfort he had once received from her, learning that strength meant being vulnerable together. But they persevered together, always together. The Broken Spur grew slowly but steadily, gaining reputation for quality horses and healthy cattle. They hired more hands as the work increased. Tom eventually retired but stayed on as an advisor, his knowledge too valuable to lose. Michael grew into a capable cowboy and married a girl from town, building a small house on the ranch's southern boundary. Diego brought his aging parents to live in one of the outbuildings, and Kane made sure they had everything they needed, understanding now that family meant more than blood. Rose became pregnant again in the spring of 1882, and this time the pregnancy held. She glowed with health and happiness, her belly growing round, and Kane was simultaneously terrified and elated. He built a cradle with his own hands, carving designs into the wood during the long winter evenings, while Rose knitted tiny clothes and decorated the spare bedroom that would become a nursery. Their son was born on a cool October morning, arriving with lusty cries and a full head of dark hair. They named him James after Rose's father, and Kane held his son with shaking hands and tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by love so fierce it felt like drowning. "Are you all right?" Rose asked, watching him from the bed where she lay exhausted but triumphant. "I'm perfect," Kane managed, unable to look away from the tiny face. "We're perfect. All of this is perfect." James was followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Catherine, after Kane's mother, a tiny, delicate creature who quickly proved to have her mother's determination and her father's stubbornness. Kane discovered he was even more terrified of raising a daughter than a son, but Rose laughed at his fears and taught him to be gentle, to braid hair, to answer endless questions with patience. The children grew up surrounded by love and horses and wide open spaces. James learned to ride almost before he could walk, following his father around with devoted attention. Catherine preferred the account books to the barn, sitting with her mother and learning mathematics and planning. They were good children, happy children, and watching them thrive, Kane sometimes had to stop and catch his breath at the sheer improbability of his life. "You're thinking too much again," Rose said one evening, finding him on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of rose and gold. "Just remembering," Kane replied, pulling her close against his side. The gesture was automatic now, natural, as essential as breathing. "Remembering what?" "Riding into Winnemucca 14 years ago, sitting in that saloon, thinking I would work for a few months and move on, never imagining any of this." He gestured at the thriving ranch, at the house where their children's laughter echoed, at the life they had built together. "Do you ever miss it? The drifting?" "Not even a little." Kane kissed her temple. "You knocked down my walls, Rose. You saw me when I was trying my hardest to be invisible. You loved me when I had forgotten how to love myself. How could I miss anything that came before that?" "Smooth talker," Rose teased, but her eyes were bright with tears. "Just honest," Kane corrected. "You taught me that too. How to be honest, how to be vulnerable, how to let someone in. You saved me, Rose. I know I helped save the ranch, but you saved me." They stood together as the sun sank below the horizon, and the first stars appeared, still holding each other, still choosing each other, still building the forever they had promised all those years ago. The cold cowboy was gone, melted away completely, and in his place stood a man who loved deeply and openly, who had learned that walls might feel safe, but connection was what made life worth living. Inside, the children called for their parents, and Kane and Rose turned together to answer, walking into their home and their future with linked hands and full hearts, proving that sometimes the best stories are the ones where cold hearts thaw, walls come down, and love wins absolutely and completely. The Broken Spur Ranch thrived for generations after that, passed down through the O'Malley line. But it began with a woman who refused to quit, and a man who learned to feel again, with the moment she walked into a saloon and demanded help, with the moment he decided to stay, with all the moments in between and after where they chose each other over and over again. It was a legacy built not just on land and cattle and horses, but on love that was strong enough to break through a decade of ice and build something warm and lasting in its place. And that, more than anything else, was what made it a story worth remembering, worth passing down, worth celebrating for all the years that followed.